The year is 2005, and Gwen Stefani will stop at nothing to teach the world how to spell bananas. This was also the year when Batman began kicking ass. YouTube started broadcasting, and Tom Cruise professed his love for Katie Holmes. But we're not here to jump on Oprah's couch, because today we're going to be counting down Electronic Gaming Monthly's best reviewed games of 2005. BANANAS indeed. When Electronic Arts signed the exclusivity deal with the NFL in 2004, most football fans assumed that Madden would be the only game in town. This was, after all, an agreement intended to kneecap the competition, including both the NFL 2K and NFL Blitz series. But as it turns out, the call was coming from inside the house. Madden's biggest competition in 2005 wasn't from some competing company, but rather from Electronic Arts. That's right, the makers of Madden. Brian explains the situation this way. When Madden snatched up the exclusive NFL license, some of you probably thought that the game would easily walk away with this season's football trophy. Well, after judging NCAA Football 06's performance, I'd say that Johnny Ballgame better start taking his little bro seriously. Patrick echoed this sentiment by noting that features are nice, but gameplay rules. Last year's awesome additions came at the slight expense of the game's speed, a deficiency that's been remedied in 06. He also mentioned that the new and much hyped Impact player feature is a bit too arcadey for him. But I'm happy that the hit stick is no longer a Madden exclusive. Thanks to the redone visuals and the cool Race for the Heisman mode, NCAA Football 06 averages a Madden defeating 9.2 out of 10. Well, I sure hope that you enjoyed the all-too-brief reminder of awesome arcade racers in 2004. Because here we are, right back to heaping praise all over the racing simulators of 2005. Gran Turismo 4 is one of two racing sims to break into the top 10, successfully fending off more over-the-top games like Ridge Racer, Burnout Legends, Burnout Revenge, and Midnight Club 3, all of which just barely missed the top 10. You see, there was a feeling at the time that the more polished racing sims were deeper and thus more worthy of the sky-high scores, a trend that largely came out of the sheer number of licensed cars, customization, and real-world locations that made up these games. But Gran Turismo 4 was the largest and deepest installment yet. It was also the lowest scoring game in the franchise. Were the EGM editors starting to slowly get sick of the formula? Che wondered if the lack of competition has made Polyphony Digital complacent. He lavished praise on the incredible graphics, but then again, it's Gran Turismo, and mind-blowing visuals are par for the course. Unlike the jump from GT2 to GT3, Gran Turismo 4's biggest contribution to the franchise is the game's fine-tuned vehicle handling. Unfortunately, this subtle upgrade can only be experienced using Logitech's awesome steering wheel peripheral, which features drastically improved wheel resistance and heavier no-slip pedals. John, on the other hand, didn't like bouncing off cars and wished that he could turn the music off mid-race, but ultimately felt like the improved physics engine was a big deal. Whereas games like Burnout 3 and Need for Speed Underground 2 feel fast, Gran Turismo 4 is the first game I've played that really gives you that sense of a car's power. With an average score of 9.2 out of 10, the editors wondered if Gran Turismo 4 could be topped. Spoiler alert, it could, and we'll talk more about that in just a few moments. The PlayStation Portable may have launched with a lot of great games, but it took the return to Liberty City for Sony's PSP to crack into one of these best of lists. Grand Theft Auto: Liberty City Stories was a revelation for the critics at EGM. I mean, it's one thing to port Twisted Metal or Tony Hawk's Underground, but GTA was the biggest franchise around, and those games were massive, both in scope and content. Now, it's important to remember that Grand Theft Auto 3 had just come out only 4 years earlier, And the thought of playing a fully 3D GTA game on a handheld was unheard of at that time. I mean, portable games in 2001 could barely handle Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, let alone a massively ambitious open-world game. Even if Rockstar had to cut a few corners and the gameplay was limited to only having one analog stick, seeing Liberty City Stories run on the PSP was a sight to behold. Greg Ford was happy to be home. So, we're back, and I can say that it's not just the living city random AI that impresses. In virtually every sense, including the angular graphics, full-fledged radio stations, and controls, Liberty City Stories is GTA. From the moment you jack your first car and hit the gas with satisfying results, you'll realize that the developer has made many improvements and a few compromises. John started his review by singling out his biggest complaint. The combat control system is still far from perfect. Despite some obvious attempts to simplify it, it's hopelessly flawed. But don't call this game broken, because he was quick to highlight the brilliant design. The game is enormous and probably the best value of anything on the system because there's just so much gameplay here. Although flawed, Liberty City Stories is a remarkable achievement. It shames the efforts many other developers have put into their PSP games. Much like San Andreas a year earlier, Grand Theft Auto Liberty City Stories exceeded expectations and earned an ambitious score of 9.2 out of 10. Was Doom 3 a good sequel? The answer to that question may depend on who and when you ask, as the sudden shift to horror and the dubious flashlight mechanics initially left the fan base polarized. While a lot of the fans have come around to Doom 3 over the years, the reviews at the time make it easy to see why there would be such a divide. Just look at how Mark starts his review. Purely in terms of gameplay, Doom 3's lack of ambition is astonishing. id Software's latest first-person shooter doesn't just remind you of its infamous decade-old forefathers, it's the same damn game. None of this is necessarily a bad thing, mind you, but in this age of Riddicks and Halos, it's a bit disappointing. He would go on to explain that the rest of the game perfectly builds on the basic foundation to create one of the most frightening and visceral experiences in gaming, but still concludes that he wanted to see more innovation out of the next sequel. The horror element was a major theme running through all of the reviews at the time. Sean warned you that it could come anytime, anywhere, crawling, charging, and hovering, half machines and all monster. In lesser shooters, you're safe until the cutscene says otherwise, and until you willingly walk through the next door. Here, Hell Knights batter you down before you can decide. The critics were impressed with the moody environments, the freaky lighting, and the horrifying bosses. They compared it more to Resident Evil than a first-person shooter, which was one of the reasons why so many Doom fans were split on this third installment. With an average score of 9.3 out of 10, the EGM editors weren't split on their appreciation for Doom 3, even if some of them wished for more innovation. Although computer owners had known for a long time that BioWare knew a thing or two about making great role-playing games, it took the release of Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic for console gamers to catch up. Now that we were all on the same page, everybody was excited to see what the Doctors would do next. That project turned out to be Jade Empire, an adventure based on Chinese mythology that saw the players control the last surviving spirit monk on a quest to save Master Li from the corrupt forces of Emperor Sun Hai. It may have been a departure from the more familiar Star Wars universe, but that didn't stop the EGM editors from falling in love. Jennifer proclaimed that BioWare has done it again. Now, it's worth noting that she wasn't convinced that they could do it again, especially without an established franchise and a change in the combat system. But big risks reap big rewards, and she's now a believer. She loved the graphics, the story, the characters, the combat, and so much more. Her biggest complaint was the relatively short length, which might be a weakness or a refreshing liberation. Sure, Shu wasn't nearly as impressed with Jade Empire, starting his review by noting a real sense of deja vu. I was hoping for so much more than a Chinese Knights of the Old Republic, but for 70% of Jade Empire, that's what I got. It's not all bad, but Jade really deserves to have its own distinct personality, separate from anything we know from KOTOR. Look, this may have been a valid criticism, but Shu was overruled by Jennifer and Brian, who helped the game average a very similar 9.3 out of 10. You know, it's hard to believe that Resident Evil 4 was ported to the PlayStation 2 only 9 months after it first hit the GameCube. Because let me tell you, it felt like an eternity listening to everybody predict that Sony's 5-year-old console was too ancient to do the game justice. As it turns out, the PlayStation 2 was more than capable of running Resident Evil 4. Sure, it looked a bit better on the GameCube, but it's not like the PlayStation 2 owners were getting a hugely scaled down port that paled in comparison. In fact, the PlayStation 2 version was so good that it landed as Electronic Gaming Monthly's 5th best reviewed game of 2005, ahead of some big hitters like Gran Turismo 4 and Jade Empire. The EGM editors agreed that very little had been lost in the transition to the PlayStation 2, and instead chose to focus on what made the game great in the first place. Mark was happy to see a proper Resident Evil game on the PlayStation 2 again after a 4-year absence. That's 4 years of settling for spin-offs. The ho-hum shooting games like Dead Aim, the frustrating Outbreak Online forays, the entire Silent Hill series. But finally, the wait is over. Resident Evil is back on the PlayStation 2, and better than ever. Scooter argued that the new content found in the port isn't enough to get you to double dip, but if you haven't played Resident Evil 4 yet, you simply must get this game. Resident Evil 4 is a great game that is no longer shackled to just one platform. Of course, this would only be the first of many, many ports of Resident Evil 4, which has now appeared on 12 different platforms by my count. GameCube fanboys may have complained, but Resident Evil 4 on the PlayStation 2 averaged a scary score of 9.5 out of 10. With the only Metal Gear installment being a weirdo strategy game on the PSP, Splinter Cell had free reign over 2005. Ubisoft took the time to release Chaos Theory, the largest and most ambitious sequel yet. But even with all of the improvements, Shu spent much of his review just trying to justify giving Chaos Theory the same 10 out of 10 score that he gave Pandora Tomorrow. In his week with the game, he noticed bugs, found the first half of the story mode lacked mind-blowing moments, laughed at the horrible voice acting, knew that most people found the Versus game too complicated, and was frustrated by the lack of closure in the co-op mode. He eventually came around because of all of the moments. It's simply brilliant. The modes, graphics, gameplay, sound, music, acting, dialogue, and every other little piece in between all come together to create a tense, sweaty palm experience you can't find anywhere else. Mark also liked the graphics, gameplay, sound, music, and so on and so forth, as well as the competitive online mode and co-op story. But he had a slightly more complicated take on the main campaign. As for the single player, well, frankly, I thought Mr. Fisher was getting a little too old for this shit, as the scruffy, middle-aged special agent himself might say. So little had changed between the original Cell and the not even a year-old Pandora Tomorrow that I really wasn't itching for more of the same. But Chaos Theory's admittedly minor tweaks taken together make what's basically the same game exciting again. Now, to be fair to EGM, all three of the reviews talked about the elements that they loved, such as the amazing level designs, the eavesdropping on enemy conversations, and the genuine humor. But I gotta say, the tone of the reviews is surprisingly negative for a game that averaged a 9.5 out of 10. Make of that what you will. With the Gran Turismo formula starting to wear a bit thin, Microsoft found the perfect opportunity to evolve the genre with a racing simulator of their own. Forza Motorsport took what worked in the competitor's racing game, streamlined the accessible interface, and added so many addictive hooks that it was impossible to put down. This is the first time the mighty Gran Turismo has been usurped by another racing simulator. And no, it wasn't a photo finish. While Sony's Racer averaged a score of 9.2 out of 10, Forza zipped way ahead with a 9.8. To quote Demian, this Xbox exclusive was better than Gran Turismo 4. He argued that Microsoft's homage to the greatest driving sim around had already lapped the competition, thanks in no small part to Forza's online multiplayer. Even without the online stuff, though, Forza is every bit as good and accurate a sim as GT. John was even more impressed with the Xbox Racer, raving that Forza's handling is impeccable. Many car sims have done an adequate job of providing an impression of the forces exerted on the car as it hurtles around the track. But in Forza, it's as though you feel the exact point where your tires lose traction. As a demo for how important clever physics models are, there are only a few experiences more tactile on Xbox. With a near-perfect average of 9.8 out of 10, Forza Motorsport had the best racing game debut in Electronic Gaming Monthly's history, and is the third best reviewed racer overall. It's also number 3 on our list of Electronic Gaming Monthly's best reviewed games of 2005, which is all the more impressive when you see what the top 2 games are. Who knew that the guy who gave us Twisted Metal would go on to resurrect the beat-em-up genre with one of Sony's most successful and enduring franchises? God of War may not have been the biggest and longest action game of the year, but what it did exceptionally well was feel epic. It was the kind of button masher where every moment came across as important, thanks in large part to the cinematic camera angles and massive boss fights that had to be seen to be believed. But what Sony had was more than just a great brawler, because the reason the game worked so well is because of its main star, Kratos. This was the best new character of the year, and somebody who wouldn't need a bunch of games to cement his place as one of the greatest action heroes of all time. Crispin summed it up perfectly. I don't care if you're Solid Snake sheathed in Master Chief's armor, supercharged with Ninja Gaiden's Kung Fu. You do not mess with Kratos. He sacrifices fellow Spartans to solve grisly puzzles. He hops into bed with togaless hotties. He's an unstoppable blade-twirling dynamo who topples creatures so towering, some pre-Simpsons Homer called them Titans. And he does all this without dropping one painful one-liner. You listening, Prince of Persia? Dana loved the gorgeous visuals and incredible action, and was quick to note that it's not that long, but the cycle of puzzles and action was starting to get a bit old by the end, so the length is just about perfect. With an average score of 9.8 out of 10, God of War was the best new IP since EGM reviewed Halo all the way back in 2002. Yeah, talk about epic. For the first time in 7 years, Electronic Gaming Monthly went a full 12 months without giving a single game an average of 10 out of 10. It's true, ever since EGM gave out their first perfect average, they have given at least one game that score every single year. Often it's 2 or 3 games, but 2005 was different. Maybe worse, depending on how you look at it. But you know, it's hard to call 2005 a lesser year when it gave us God of War, Jade Empire, Forza Motorsport, and our #1 game, Resident Evil 4. Look, we already talked about the PlayStation 2 port, so now it's time to talk about the version that started it all. For fans of the series, Resident Evil 4 was a breath of fresh air. It's important to remember that nearly a full decade of survival horror cliches had weighed down the franchise to the point of almost feeling like a parody by 2005. You saw this in Mark's review. Forget what you know or what you think you know about Resident Evil. Resident Evil 4 not only brings the series out of its creative rut, it also packs the most refined graphics and gameplay in survival horror since, well, ever. I don't care how sky high your expectations are. Resident Evil 4 will blow them away again and again. Milkman loved that this was a sea change for the series, calling it an amazing example of a game making good on its potential. Gone are the crappy inventory system of old, the stupid save ribbons, the feeble-minded undead that have defined Resident Evil. I can't emphasize enough how this is a brand new game. With both of those critics giving the game perfect 10s, what could possibly have tarnished the score? Well, apparently it's the goofy dialogue and the lack of strafing that did the game in. Oh well, I doubt anybody's going to be too disappointed with Resident Evil 4 earning a 9.8 out of 10, making it not only the top-rated game of the series, but also Electronic Gaming Monthly's best-reviewed game of 2005. Thanks for watching this episode of EGM's Best and Worst. If you liked what you saw here, then you should know that we're posting new episodes twice a week leading up to the new year. Now, here's the question I have for you. What is your favorite game from 2005? Even though no game got a perfect 10, it was still a massive year. Not only did we get God of War and Resident Evil 4, but we also got the Xbox 360 launch. I can't wait to see your picks in the comments below. In other news, we're going to be back on Friday to count down the worst reviewed games of 2005, and you definitely won't want to miss that. If that sounds good to you, then I strongly recommend you click that subscribe button and support what we're doing here. Until then,